Hello again everyone, Juan-Carlos Peña here with our last video of the series. This time we will be mainly focusing on musicality, vibrato and the execution of trills and mordents as we work on the first movement, Adagio, from Benedetto Marcello's Sonata No.2 in E minor. These Baroque sonatas, written originally for the cello, are not only beautiful, but they provide us with great opportunities to develop our musicianship. The slow movements are very much like opera arias that can help us develop our singing voice with our instruments. And the fast movements are spirited and fun to work on while being technically accessible. Sonata No.2 is probably the one that is played the most, and is sometimes required for college auditions. There are different editions, but I like to use Lucas Drew's edition of all 6 sonatas in one volume. The suggested bowings, dynamics, ornamentation, and fingerings are well thought of and idiomatic for the bass. Okay, let's get started. The first thing that we need to have clear is that in all these slow movements, we are going to subdivide the pulse. The 8th note becomes the beat. On the technical side of this movement, we have to make sure that we are playing the recurring hooked daughter rhythm correctly and not as a triplet. For this, we have to be subdividing the beat into 4 30-second notes in our heads, just like this. And not like triplets. Now that we have the correct rhythm in place, the challenge is to keep the sustain, the shape and the direction of the phrase going. This is where we need to find our singing voice. The dynamic markings and the ornamentation for this music was minimal. It was expected that the performer would follow the shape of the music to increase or decrease the intensity accordingly. Now, if you notice in the middle of the second bar, in the last note that I just played, we have a mordent on that D sharp quarter note. The squiggly line that looks like an M. This is executed by starting on the main note, in this case the D sharp, and then playing the upper note in quick manner, in this case the E, and then returning back to the main note, like this. The other type of ornament that we will be dealing with in this piece is the trill. The trill is similar to the mordent. You play the main note, and then you go to the note above, and then back to the main note. But instead of doing it just once, you repeat that motion several times. The amount of times you do this will depend on the length of the main note as well as the speed that you choose. For example, slow trill, fast trill. The trill would normally be done as whole steps or half steps, depending on the key signatures. In terms of fingerings, the whole step trill, basically, we have no choice but to use fingers 1 and 4. But for the half step ones, we could use 1 and 2 or 2 and 4. I prefer using 1 and 2 because you can obtain clarity and evenness more easily. But occasionally, depending on the passage, you might want to stick with the 2 and the 4. Now, in the music of the Baroque era, there's another element that we need to discuss, and that is that the trills are generally started with the note above the main note as an appoggiatura to emphasize the dissonance. Although some people start the trills in this music on the main note if the preceding note is the same as the upper note of the trill. which works because the dissonance is already implied on that previous note. But I personally like to emphasize that top dissonance note, while at the same time it allows me to be consistent with my trills. After leaning on that top note, I'd like my trills to start not too fast so that I can gradually increase the speed through the end of the note until the resolution. Now, one of the hardest things for students when first attempting to do trills is knowing when to exit onto the next note without losing the sense of pulse. We can address that issue like this. If we have a 1.5 beats trill with a half beat resolution into the next beat, we need to make sure that we are strongly feeling the middle beat in the trill so that the resolution comes naturally. For example, one, two. So you feel that strong middle beat really strongly. Two. It is also very important that you practice the ornamented passages without any ornamentation to reinforce the underlying rhythm accurately. Now, I would like to briefly talk about vibrato. In the Baroque era, the use of vibrato was limited to special moments in the phrase, just as an ornament. In our modern way of playing, we are pretty much expected to vibrate continuously, making vibrato an essential part of our sound. I'm not going to pretend that I'm a specialist in Baroque performance practice, but when approaching a piece like this, at least I like to lighten up my vibrato and try to add more variety to my sound from what I do with my bow arm. On the other hand, I think it's okay if you play this piece in a more modern, romanticized way, and if you're starting to develop your vibrato, this could be a good way to work it out. Finally, before I go over the complete movement, let me just talk about the little cadenza in measure 13. This does not appear in other editions, but I think that arriving at this moment in the music with the underlying harmony and the fermata on the downbeat, it would have been certainly expected that the performer would improvise a small cadenza. So I think it's a great addition by the editor. Anyway, when you perform a cadenza, you should do it with lots of freedom, but making sure that you still have a congruent musical idea and that the line flows naturally. Okay, here's the Adagio from the second sonata by Marcello. this is it for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope we will connect again soon.